Yes.
Ready you are.
Okay. Alright. Who remembers Harambe? Alright, just to refresh you, because it was a couple years ago, Harambe was a 17-year-old gorilla who was shot and killed because a 4-year-old little boy fell into his exhibit. Now, it's understandable that his zoo care officials shot him because if he was tranquilized, it would just not been in time to save the boy. So they had to shoot and kill him in order to prevent further harm to him. And so this is just one example of animals' lives being forsaken for humans. So I can assume that all you guys have been to a zoo before, right? So have I. So I wanted to expand on my informative speech that I did a couple of months ago. I talked about animal endangerment and gave a little backstory because I'm from Florida where a lot of wildlife and fish are being compromised. So today I want to persuade you guys that we should focus our attention away from zoos. Instead, we should focus on our local rehabilitation and sanctuaries. So in order to understand about zoos a bit more, I wanted to provide a brief history. So the first zoos were known as menageries. And menageries began as a reference to domestic animals and livestock, but grew to describe the collections of royalty, the animal collections that they had. So this is from National Geographic, and they said that the wall carvings found in Egypt and Mesopotamia are evidence that rulers and aristocrats created menageries as early as 2500 BC. They left records of expeditions to distant places to bring back exotic animals, such as giraffes, elephants, bears, dolphins, and birds. I don't know how they transported that back then, but they did. And this is just a visual representation of how the animals are kind of look more like pictures on a wall rather than actual habitats. This brings us into the Age of Enlightenment, which was from 1620 to 1780. We all learned about it. And it's an age of science, reason, and logic. And in this time, scientists wanted to study animals and understand their behavior and anatomy more. And while this was great for veterinarian practices, they did continue to keep animals in cages and not really provide them the freedom that they deserve. And this brings us to modern zoos, which are the zoos that we know today. And early zoos like the menagerie were more like museums of living animals than natural habitats. Animals were kept in small display areas, kind of like the photo that I showed you earlier, with as many species as space would allow. And the first modern zoo that we have was in 1793 in Paris. So now that I introduced you to the history, I want to show you guys what the problem that I see in zoos are and give you a couple points that I noticed. So the first point I want to make is that zoos are detrimental to the mental health of animals. So if you're a little queasy, you might want to plug your ears because this is a little hard to hear. But this is an example from the Cumbrian Zoo, which is a zoo in Britain. And they are notorious for, in the past 5 years, they've had 500 animal deaths. So at this zoo, from World Animal News, a jaguar was killed after it chewed off its paw. Snow leopards were left partially eaten. A 3-year-old rhino was crushed to death. A squirrel monkey's body was found behind a radiator. And those are just a couple of disturbing accounts that they've noticed. And this is just describing like the animal's behavior when they're kept in enclosures that aren't allowing them to grow as much. So the second point I want to make is that animals being exposed to human interaction is not safe for us, and it also isn't safe for the animals. So this is I'm from Florida, so this is a Florida man story. This was from my senior year in high school, so about 2 years ago. And this is Pinky, the flamingo. He was at the Tampa Zoo, which used to be called Lowry Park. And this man jumped into Pinky's enclosure. You literally could just walk over the gate and you'd be in the flamingo enclosure. And he basically beat up the flamingo to death, and Pinky died. And so this is just an example of like an unnecessary death. And if Pinky weren't in this position in Florida, he probably would still be alive. And the last point I want to make about the problems that I see in zoos are that animals are dying unnecessarily, like I've already kind of mentioned. So this example is from the Danish Zoo, and this is Marius the giraffe. And Time magazine said that they had no choice but to euthanize the 2-year-old giraffe because Marius was part of an international breeding program whose bylaws prohibit inbreeding in an effort to maintain the health of the stock. So Marius's body was, It was dissected in front of the crowd, in front of tourists at this zoo, and then his body was later fed to the lions, which is pretty gruesome. And although that would happen in nature, because lions do eat giraffes, it shouldn't be encouraged by humans. So now that I've shown you a couple of the problems I see with zoos, I do want to bring to light that there is a solution, and we can affect that. And that solution is that we can support our local rehabilitation centers and sanctuaries. So I provided a couple definitions for you guys if you don't know the difference between the three. So a sanctuary is where injured animals go to live out the rest of their lives and be taken care of. A zoo is an establishment where a collection of animals live, and they are for study, for conservation, and more prominently, they're put on just display for the public for entertainment. And then a rehabilitation center is where injured animals go to be taken care of real quickly and then re-released back into the wild as quickly as possible. So I encourage you to look into your local rehabilitation centers. I know I did. So this is from the Florida Aquarium. My mom actually sent me this when I told her I was doing this speech. And this opened, the Sea Turtle Rehabilitation Center opened about a couple weeks ago, maybe a month ago. And basically it is part of the aquarium, so not always the best. But because the center is closed off to the public, it is for the betterment of the sea turtles. They basically take the baby turtles off the beach, and then they hatch and stuff at the center, and then they're re-released back into the ocean. And not only does this center take care of sea turtles, but they are also breeding coral so that we can repopulate and replenish our reefs. Because we all know like the Great Barrier Reef is dying, and so is everywhere else in the world, so that's a great thing. So I hope today that I showed you guys the problems that I see in zoos, and I hope that I motivated you to look into your local centers and divert your attention to that. So if we've learned anything from Harambe, it's that legends never die and neither should be animals.